There was a senior Israeli official who once said that 2 key Palestinian cities are at their mercy and that they could starve them out. Sounds familiar, right? To the tactics we've seen Israel use in Gaza over the past 2 years. But it was a statement said far earlier than all of that. It was Israel's founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion who made that remark in December 1947, that Haifa and Jaffa were at their mercy and they can starve them out. And that's exactly what they did. In the Nakba in 1948, Zionist forces carried out their plans to forcibly evict the indigenous populations of these areas. Large-scale intimidation, bombarding town centers, setting fire to homes, properties and crops, and laying siege to the areas they wanted to occupy. The results: destruction, deprivation and hunger that left Palestinians with no other choice but to flee their hometowns.
Victorious Haganah troops have driven the Arabs out of the beleaguered city, taking many prisoners.
Haganah forces seek out every Arab, and barricades are set up to screen those who had not already fled the city.
This is how Israel used mass starvation in Gaza to uproot and forcibly displace Gaza's people. Now let's go back to 2006, when Israel's policy at the time was summed up by an advisor to then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who said the quiet part out loud. He said the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. The feeling of hunger is supposed to encourage the Palestinians to force Hamas to change its attitudes towards Israel, or force Hamas out of government. After Hamas came into power in 2007, Israel severely intensified its siege and significantly tightened existing movement restrictions, essentially isolating the Gaza Strip from the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories and the world.
Then you have basically this siege institutionalized around 1993, when Israel began to surround Gaza with a giant fence. It began to close it off from the world, and they began to formalize this siege on Gaza, the starvation, the hunger, the thirst, and it goes to a peak during the peace process, ironically. So the New York Times interviewed Palestinians in 1995, and they're asking, how do you feel about the peace process? How do you feel about Oslo? And the most resonant word they used in the article was open air prison. And the article's headline was something like, Palestinians learn freedom has its limits. Ironically, like they were not even trying to hide it. It was there in the open. But you see it even more extreme and more lunatic when Israel goes on full starvation mode against Gaza. They wanted to manufacture hunger of epic proportions in 2006, when Hamas won an elections that were regarded as free and fair by people like Jimmy Carter and the international community. And then Israel immediately suffocates Gaza with a punishing blockade. When Hamas takes over Gaza the year after, they formalize the blockade and announce Gaza a hostile entity, although it's under occupation, so they couldn't do so legally.
Israel's strict land, sea and air blockade means it can dictate exactly which people and which goods can pass in and out of the Israeli-controlled crossings. Then in 2008, there was a significant policy change. The Israeli agency that controls aid shipments into Gaza, called COGAT, calculated that Palestinians needed an average minimum of 2,279 calories per person per day to live off. The guiding principle was that instead of the supply of goods being dictated by demand, it would be dictated by the quantities and varieties deemed necessary by COGAT. But the amount of food and aid that Israel allowed into Gaza often didn't meet the quantities that it stated were sufficient to sustain life. In 2009, investigations into Israel's actions at the time revealed that during the 2008 to 2009 Gaza war, Israel's attacks and invasion had caused deliberate and massive destruction to Gaza's agricultural sector. Israel also declared 30% of the most fertile land in Gaza as no-go zones. Israel's policies of restrictions on dual-use items dealt a significant blow to life in Gaza. Items like cement, steel, wood, medical equipment, pipes, and even smoke detectors were acknowledged by Israel to have civilian use, but it also argued that they could be repurposed for hostile activities, such as weapons production or tunnel construction. Israel's dual-use list is extensive and inconsistent. Some items are specific chemicals like ammonium chloride, whilst others are vague, such as communications equipment. To highlight the arbitrariness of these policies, in 2008, COGAT allowed shampoo but still banned conditioner. In 2009, plain hummus was permitted, but hummus with pine nuts was not. And the result? Severe shortages of essential materials, crippling Gaza's ability to rebuild, maintain healthcare, and sustain essential industries. With an opaque and difficult approval process, the system reinforces Israel's control over Gaza's economy and daily life.
The problem with aid is just its weaponization, as well is used as a bait to displace people, which is another aspect. Forcing people to move in certain areas where they can access food. So it's being used to meet like military objectives. It is blocked whenever Israel desired. It is used as a bargaining chip. It is a collective punishment. It's simply a war crime.
During each of the major wars on Gaza, Israel imposed strict limitations on what could enter or exit the Strip, then often leveraged the easing of these restrictions as negotiation chips when it came to ceasefire talks. Whilst Gaza had never in its history reached the stages of malnutrition, in 2022 over 64% of the population were food insecure. Approximately 80% of the population depended on aid from the UN and international NGOs. And this is where Israel took aim to further cripple the society after October 2023. UNRWA was set up in 1949 to support Palestinian refugees displaced by the Nakba, including 1.4 million refugees registered in Gaza alone. Up until 2023, the UN had run around 400 distribution centers across the Gaza Strip, with at least 80% of the population relying on their aid. Every day, 600 to 700 aid trucks were needed to cover Gaza's basic needs, and they had to reach all parts of the Strip to distribute food and supplies effectively and evenly. Israel repeatedly accused UNRWA of being infiltrated and linked to Hamas and other groups in Gaza. Yet, as Hamas is also the governing body in Gaza, UNRWA said its engagement with the de facto authorities took place solely on an operational level, with the exclusive purpose of delivering humanitarian and aid services. In January 2025, Israel banned UNRWA entirely, and by the 14th of October 2025, 936 incidents impacting UNRWA buildings and the people inside them had been reported, including 197 UNRWA employees killed by Israeli attacks on Gaza. A recent forensic architecture investigation concluded that Israel had systematically dismantled the long-standing and effective civilian model of aid distribution through well-established aid organizations in Gaza. Previous analysis conducted by forensic architecture shows that the Israeli military has repeatedly targeted aid distribution across Gaza since October 2023, attacks that have persisted despite Israel claiming it would investigate the incidents each time.
Israel's rationale here is basically this. These organizations do not only function as sort of providers of humanitarian aid, they are credible witnesses on the ground. So we killed the journalists, we prevented international journalists from going in, but we still have a problem with UN agencies, those foreigners that have access to Gaza. What do we do about them? Delegitimize, block, prevent, intimidate, terrorize, because you cannot get away with killing them the way you did with journalists. You cannot get away with calling Jose Andres Hamas. It wouldn't work. So make their work impossible.
And the attacks on Gaza's food sovereignty didn't stop at aid agencies. By late 2024, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization reported that nearly 70% of Gaza's cropland had been damaged or destroyed. Greenhouses, orchards, and wells were flattened by airstrikes or bulldozed by Israeli ground forces. In its September 2024 assessment, the FAO said the destruction was systematic and rendered agricultural livelihoods almost impossible. By summer 2025, that figure had climbed to even higher, to 86% of Gaza's cropland being damaged, and 1.5% was still accessible and usable. Various reports also revealed that Israeli forces deliberately target farmers and prevent them from harvesting what remains of their crops.
We're talking about almost 85% of Gaza Strip within displacement orders, no-go zones, military zones in which Israel has full control over and are dangerous. People cannot simply go there. So within this 85% of land lies a lot of farmlands. Whenever any farmers approach, they get shot.
If you just, before October 7th, open Google, and write, "Israel shoots farmer." You will find a headline almost daily of Israel. Every day, farmers would go to their lands because those agricultural lands in Gaza are in close proximity to the border area or the perimeter fence. Israel does not have defined borders. So every time they would go there, the IDF would shoot at them.
Territory where roughly a quarter of the population once depended on agriculture and fishing, this was like an economic humanitarian death sentence, destroying people's ability to grow or catch their own food and monopolizing the control of every calorie that entered the strip. Now let's talk about the looting of aid, because some of the aid that was getting into Gaza throughout the peak of Israel's military campaign was being frequently looted and hijacked. The goods were then being sold on the markets in Gaza for extortionate prices. Israel accused Hamas of carrying out these looting campaigns, launching a broad Israeli media campaign repeated by Israeli officials and their supporters. It was in fact armed Israeli-backed groups that were repeatedly looting and raiding aid trucks as soon as they entered Gaza, doing so in areas that normal civilians were barred from reaching. With these lootings as an excuse, on March 2nd, 2025, Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel would completely cut off all food and aid supplies entering Gaza. Israeli human rights groups said at the time that Israel quietly adopted a starve or leave policy for northern Gaza. As reiterated by UN aid agencies, Israel was weaponizing food to force Palestinians to flee south, where there's still no guarantee of safety or shelters for the displaced. The only other option was to remain in the north and starve to death. But rather than allow the correct distribution methods to do their work, Israel has undermined such systems to pave the way for a militarized aid distribution system that directed the forced displacement of residents of specific areas. Enter the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, which began operating in May 2025, a new US and Israeli-backed so-called aid organization run by armed mercenaries and private security firms, distributing food and supplies at what it called secure sites, which were militarized, fenced-off collection points strategically located. Humanitarian experts warned from day one that the GHF was not designed to help, and the parties involved didn't have the necessary experience or manpower to successfully deliver aid distribution to meet the scale of needs in Gaza as a result of 1.5 years of Israeli attacks and blockade. But the real aims of GHF were evident simply by looking at the locations of the 4 distribution sites, 3 in the south of Gaza and only 1 in the most starved area of the north, keeping in mind that UNRWA once had around 400 distribution centers across Gaza. GHF worked almost like a trap to lure Gaza's population to relocate to the south. The reality of how these GHF sites operated was unlike anything in the history of aid distribution. Thousands of desperate Palestinians were forced to walk for miles to reach these cages, where chaos, shootings, and stampedes often broke out. Aid distribution sites were open for only 15 minutes a day, and throughout the 3 months that they operated, every time they opened, GHF staff and Israeli forces fired at Palestinians seeking aid, citing alleged security threats to their staff. What was presented as secure aid distribution quickly became known, as one observer called it, a death trap disguised as charity. Yet, from the dire need in Gaza, people continued to queue up at the sites as there was no other alternative at the time. Many even began to move closer to the sites to reduce the distance they had to walk and wait each day. Forensic architecture documented several ways in which the Israeli system of aid distribution contributed to the forced displacement and reconcentration of Gaza's civilian population in areas which put their lives at risk and couldn't sufficiently support civilian life. The adoption of an aid distribution model that requires people to relocate closer to the GHF ration sites, in addition to evacuation orders that forced Palestinians into a state of perpetual displacement, and areas to which people were ordered to evacuate were later attacked, as well as areas under evacuation orders being absorbed by an ever-expanding Israeli buffer zone in which systematic demolition was occurring. Alternative methods of delivering aid to a population being forcibly starved by Israel were ultimately concluded to be performative and totally ineffective. As land crossings were repeatedly blocked, countries such as the UAE, Jordan, and France attempted to get aid to Gaza through aid airdrops. The efforts lasted only a few weeks each time before being quietly phased out. Experts, including the UN's own humanitarian chief, said these airdrops were symbolic at best, and aid agencies said if there's political will to stage costly air shows, there must be political will to open the land crossings. But that was precisely what Israel refused to do. By August 2025, the UN's Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the body that officially measures famine, confirmed what many people were dreading. Famine was present and spreading in Gaza. Over 500,000 people were found to be suffering from catastrophic hunger, the worst possible category. Another 1 million faced emergency levels of food insecurity. The IPC called it an entirely man-made famine that could be halted or reversed if food and aid were allowed in. Children's bodies showed the evidence first. Thin, hollow faces, their growth stunted, their immune systems collapsing. Doctors reported cases of malnutrition that had not been seen in generations. By September 2025, at least 430 people had been starved to death. Nearly a third of them were children. And even for those who survived, the toll was immense. Exhaustion, dizziness, fainting, and permanent cognitive damage in children. Starvation is a slow and silent weapon that attacks the bodies, minds, social fabrics, and ability for a people to function and prosper.
Even healthy young people are experiencing fatigue and they're tired, they're wasting away, and it's just at some point you'd walk in the streets and it feels so apocalyptic, watching everyone just like so tired, so literally starved. You can see it, you can see how weak everyone feels.
Now the reality is that whereas it is in theory possible to do a targeted airstrike, a targeted artillery strike, you cannot do a targeted policy of starvation, because what we know from experience, and it makes common sense as well, that it's the armed men, the men with guns in a population, who starve last. So that if there is a population of 2 million, and then there within that population of 2 million civilians, there's several tens of thousands of armed men, the civilians have to starve first before the armed men starve. That's why starvation is prohibited under international humanitarian law, because it cannot be done in a targeted manner.
At the same time, Israel issued wave after wave of displacement orders, forcing families to flee again and again. Areas once designated as safe zones were later bombed. Combined with the expanding no-go zones and buffer areas, more than 80% of Gaza's land has been rendered either unsafe for life or completely inaccessible. In total, about 1.9 million Palestinians, which is roughly 90% of Gaza's population, has been displaced. Many reporting that they have been displaced over 20 times, pushed from north to south, then herded into narrow coastal strips of barren land without infrastructure, clean water, or shelter. Israel's campaign of enforced starvation became one of the defining pillars of its genocidal war, a systematic effort to erase life, dignity, and the possibility of return. Human rights groups have described the campaign as a deliberate policy of forced displacement and ethnic cleansing. That 58% of Gaza under Israeli control is completely depopulated. Any civilian who tries to return or enter is shot on sight. By destroying the farmland, bombing homes and hospitals, and blocking humanitarian aid, Israel has made vast areas of Gaza completely unlivable, ensuring that civilians either starve where they are or end up in inhumane conditions in line with Israel's plan. Part of Trump's Gaza peace plan stated that the Israeli army will not return to areas it has withdrawn from, as long as all parties fully implement the agreement. But this would mean that Israel compromises on many of the secondary goals it began pursuing over the past 2 years, raising serious questions about how much rebuilding Israel will actually permit, especially in northern Gaza, where Israel decimated entire neighborhoods that now border the newly expanded Israeli buffer zone. So even if reconstruction resumes, Israel may still limit it through the same restrictive policies that it used to starve Gaza's population and strangle its economy. So what peace then? For those living in tents or those living in the ruins of their homes, waiting to see whether the end of this war will bring about rebuilding or simply another kind of siege.